And I call the Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Second motion is with respect to the sitting calendar. I present the revised program of sittings for the 2020 and move that the program be agreed to, and copies of the program have been placed on the table. Now, I understand that leave is going to be given with respect to this, but there may be a division.
The Manager of Opposition Business, yes.
Yeah, leave's granted in accordance with the resolution for this to be additional business that we deal with. I'll want to speak on it.
Yeah, okay. Yes, the Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. Mr Speaker, the alterations to the sitting calendar that are being proposed this evening relate in large part to the fact that last week the Prime Minister noted that putting budgets together at this time, with the enormous uncertainty that exists in predicting and anticipating and estimating economic parameters, is not something that any Commonwealth or state government should be doing, and indeed those governments have in effect decided not to put together budgets at what is the usual time in or about May. The Treasurer has noted that forecasting for budgets is very difficult at the best of times, let alone we're in the midst of the economic uncertainty that we are experiencing at the moment. As a result, members would be aware that the government has decided that we will not be handing down a budget until the first Tuesday in October, being 6th of October. Earlier today, the House agreed to necessary measures on supply and other continuances to ensure the proper functioning of the government services and continuation of vital programs to ensure the government does not need to pass the budget in May. I might note that I understand that there's likely to be division with respect to the sitting calendar. Something else that has played in the government's mind is that whilst we've run today's session very efficiently and with great cooperation, some risk attaches to the operation of Parliament, particularly during what is anticipatably the peak point in the transmission of the coronavirus. Obviously, we come from all points in Australia. We've done our level best today, I think, to conduct this session and today's sittings with all of the appropriate social distancing that's been recommended for Australia at large, but nevertheless some risk attaches to the flying in of multiple members from every corner in Australia, and some attention to that fact has been had in redesigning the sitting calendar that is now before the House.
So the question is the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to, and I call the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. The opposition will be opposing the changes to the sitting calendar, while we acknowledge that there are some changes that do need to be made. Clearly, when the government announces that the budget will be held at a different time, then that needs to be reflected in a revised calendar, and the government has done that here. What the government has also done, though, is eliminate any sittings during May and June. It may well be that by the time we get to May and June, we find that we can't sit. And if that's the case, then it is entirely the prerogative of the government to give advice to the Speaker that they believe the sitting needs to be cancelled. We have previously cancelled a week of sittings based on the fact that the member for New England at the time was before the High Court. There were 2 by-elections on. It was going to change the numbers on the floor, and a week of sittings was suddenly cancelled. If we can do it on those circumstances when it needs to happen, then we can do it with respect to a pandemic if we get there and it needs to happen. The reason the opposition believes that we shouldn't make that decision today is, as everyone is acknowledging, we don't know where we will be in May or June, and the presumption should be that the Parliament will sit. The presumption should be that we will meet, because, can I say, during this period, if it is possible for us to sit, during a time of crisis, it's when the Australian public needs us to sit. I would be more than surprised if we can go from now till August and find that the legislation we put through the Parliament today is all the nation needs for Australia to handle this pandemic. That the legislation we put through today is all the nation needs to be able to deal with the crisis of unemployment and recession that we'll be facing. And that means we will need to sit. So we shouldn't pretend that we won't. And it also means during this period, the government will be compelled, in the interests of the nation, to make some decisions of great magnitude. That will happen. We know that will happen. That's part of the story behind the supply bills that have just gone past. To have decisions of that magnitude being made without the Parliament convening and without there being a question time and an opportunity for people representing the different corners of Australia to hold the government to account is an unwise course for us to take. So I won't detain the House longer than that, but I will simply remind us, if we find that for health reasons in some way that there is a difficulty in the Parliament meeting, there are resolutions that we will deal with later today to make sure that we are still able to meet as a Parliament. What we should not be doing, and that's all being done with a full level of cooperation and good common sense between myself and the Leader of the House. Of all the decisions that have been made procedurally, this one is the only one where we have disagreement. To think at a time of crisis where, and let's not forget in terms of legislation, some of what we dealt with in legislation today was only announced and determined by the Australian government yesterday. Yesterday. It is unthinkable that we will make it through to the 11th of August without the nation needing us to convene. It may well be that in addition to May and June, we find we're back here in July as well. It may well be that before we even get to when we were meant to sit in May, in April, or even later this month, we may find there is an emergency reason that we need to sit. I have to say, the plans that have been made in the government's narrative of keeping people in work, I have no confidence that they're going to keep people in work. The apprentices one, for those numbers, there's a direct wage subsidy, that may well be able to do it, but for the others, and I said in an earlier speech, I'm just not confident that that's how it's going to unfold. I'm simply not confident. I hope, we all hope, that what's been announced today and what's gone through the Parliament today is enough. But I would be deeply surprised if it is. Therefore, in us opposing the sitting calendar, we're simply saying to the government, keep the presumption of the dates that we are here in May and June. If we need to meet earlier than that, we will cooperate with that. If the sittings, when we get to those dates, mean that we find the Parliament can't sit, then the usual communication between the government and the Speaker will cause those sittings to be cancelled at the time. But to presume that we don't need to be back here until the 11th of August defies logic, defies common sense, and is something that the Labor Party, the opposition, cannot support.
The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to, and I call the Leader of the Greens.
Mr. Speaker, the Greens can't support cancellation of sitting weeks in advance where we don't know where we're going to be at that stage. We don't know what's going to be required of us as MPs or of the government, and we don't know how the government stimulus package is going to play out. We've just passed, in a very short period of time, with very little scrutiny and very little notice, legislation to give the government the authority to spend an enormous amount of money and to make an enormous amount of changes. And that has happened in this Parliament because there is a recognition from everyone in this place that we are confronting a crisis and we are confronting an emergency and urgent steps need to be taken. But it is because it is so unprecedented and because so many changes have been made and because such a large amount of money is going to be spent and because there is so much at stake, so many lives at stake, so many livelihoods at stake, so many jobs at stake, so many people who don't have work, their livelihoods are at stake as well, that we need the capacity to work out whether more changes need to be made, whether we got it right, whether we got it wrong. Now, in the short period of time that we've had, we've already been able to identify a number of areas where the government has left people behind. We've already found that carers, for example, are not going to get the coronavirus supplement. The people on disability support pension are not going to get it. The people who are studying are not going to get it. Now, I asked the government earlier what's the rationale for that, and they had none. The minister just sat there in silence. They had none. That's probably because there is none, and probably because this has been rushed. I understand the circumstances for the rushing it, but in rushing things, governments can make mistakes. And it is because of that, because we've already been able to identify people who've been left behind, sectors like hospitality and tourism that don't have specific packages for them, big gaps, for example, in the continuation of the mutual obligation, the continued requirements around mutual obligation for people who are receiving social security payments. We just haven't had the time, because we've all agreed to come here and in good faith and work on this on an urgent basis, to work out exactly who's been left behind and what more is going to be needed. Now, part of the reason, certainly from our perspective, that we were willing to engage in this in good faith and show and say to the government, yes, we accept this needs to be done and done quickly, even though we would do it differently, was that there were further sitting weeks scheduled in not too distant future that could give us a chance to come back here after being with our constituents and seeing how this is playing out, to come back and say, look, some changes are needed. We do need to look after students and give them the coronavirus supplement, because too many of them have now lost so much money they can't afford their rent, they're in dire straits. We thought we'd have the chance to come back and argue to plug some of the gaps, and I suspect to have to massively increase the level of stimulus that's going to be required. If it turns out that in a few weeks' time it is not safe for Parliament to sit, then it must be within our wit to be able to work out alternative ways of making such decisions if we need to. There's been a good degree of goodwill and cooperation here today, and people's safety has been a priority as well, and we've been able to balance that. Surely, we should be able to work out if further urgent decisions need to be made, how to make them if Parliament has to be cancelled. But the starting point in an emergency is to have more democracy, not less. Okay? And the presumption that simply because there is a crisis we should cancel Parliament is a worrying one. Yes, we should definitely impose restrictions if safety requires it, and if it is putting people at risk for us all to come here and meet again, because that is what the health advice says, then of course let's listen to the health advice. But that's not the basis on which this is being put forward. And so we can't support a change that automatically removes another several months of opportunities to debate and improve the package and scrutinise the government spending and hold the government to account. The fact that the government's already made mistakes and left people behind does not give us that requisite confidence. We thought we'd have the opportunity to come back after talking to our constituents and tidy up any gaps, and the removal of it is not one that we can support. And it is, I must say, concerning that one of the first responses of the government in this is to cancel the opportunity for scrutiny. Yes, by all means, let's cancel them on a week-by-week basis if that's what it turns out, if that turns out to be the medical advice. But the Greens cannot support the cancellation of Parliament in advance, especially in a time of emergency.
Question is the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to, and I call the member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker, for the opportunity to add to the compelling points made by the member for Melbourne and also especially the member for Watson before him. Clearly the idea that we know now that the Parliament won't need to sit until August is absurd. When you think about the rapidly evolving nature of this health crisis, when you think about the rapidly deteriorating economy which is coming as a consequence of that diabolical challenge to our health system, that we won't need to agree new measures, or we won't need to, as the member for Melbourne said, scrutinise the measures which were only announced yesterday and legislated today. The idea that the government has just perfectly nailed every aspect of this $66 billion in new spending, it's absurd, Mr. Speaker. And as others have pointed out, it would be one thing if the government came to us and said, we think from a rolling fortnightly basis that the Parliament shouldn't sit for health, on the basis of health advice or for other reasons, that the Parliament can't sit. But the idea that we can just assume now that the Parliament need not sit till August. It just doesn't make sense. You know, if they can say to us, if those opposites can say to us, Mr Speaker, that they have got every aspect of this package right, or that they know in every way how this economic crisis is going to unfold, then that's another thing. But they can't do that for obvious and understandable reasons. The other point I wanted to make, Deputy Speaker, is that it's not the Labor Party which is saying on its own that there will be more needed to be done. The government itself said yesterday, before it even released its second package of stimulus, the Finance Minister was on early morning TV saying we will need a third wave of stimulus. By the time the Treasurer and the Prime Minister stood up in the Prime Minister's courtyard later that day, they weren't just talking about a third wave of stimulus, but a fourth and a fifth and subsequent waves of stimulus. And we've made our views on that well known, that we also think that additional support will be necessary. And if we know now that that additional support is necessary, then let's get cracking on it. But the Parliament will not be sitting for much longer in this session. And so if there is to be subsequent waves of stimulus, for good reason, well-founded reasons, that the economy deteriorates further, that more lives and livelihoods are destroyed, then we need to have the capacity for the Parliament to sit and agree, as we have today, on the necessary measures to support the economy and to support people in particular in that deteriorating economy. So for all of the reasons that the member for Watson identified and all the reasons the member for Melbourne identified, it makes no sense for us not to sit until August. In terms of the economic considerations, there will be problems with what the government has proposed. It's only been from the announcement of the package until the passage through this place, it was only 27 or 28 hours. $66 billion were outlaid, plus the original $17 billion. So $83 billion of taxpayer money was outlaid with very little notice, and we've done our best to work through the legislation that we were provided, and we've done our best to come to a good, sound judgment on that legislation. We support it. We want to get it out the door as soon as possible. But the idea that there's nothing in there that might need to be fixed or tweaked, it doesn't make a lot of sense to us. The economy is in serious strife for all of the reasons that we know in this place and we've spent today talking about. We need to give ourselves the capacity as a democracy, as the People's House of the Australian Parliament, we need to give ourselves the capacity to do more and to fix and improve and tweak what has already been done. And if we agree here that we're not going to sit in August, then we rob ourselves of that opportunity to do the right thing by the people who sent us here.
The question is that the motion moved by the Leader of the House be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. I think the ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes.